What's up, guys? Michael here. It's not every day you get to talk about a topic as broad and as fascinating as monsters. Small monsters, big monsters, medium monsters named Paul who accidentally eat your world-class mac and cheese in the middle of the night. But today, we're doing just that. And full disclosure, this is made possible by the very cool people at Capcom and Monster Hunter Rise, which is a franchise I'm proud to say at least one Wisecrack staffer has dumped at least several hundred hours into. So here's the idea we're exploring today. Monsters might be synonymous with scary, but what if that's kind of all wrong? What if we're missing out on the way monsters can teach us about ourselves and the world around us? We'll explain in this philosophy of monsters. Human beings have been fascinated by the idea of monsters from our earliest days, but they really came into their own in the Western imagination in ancient Greece. These folks waxed poetic about spooky figures ranging from the Pastinaka, a monstrous weasel that reeked so hard it stank-killed trees, or the Typhus, a dragon with 100 heads, so at least none of them could ever possibly get lonely, which I'm just saying, Capcom, would make for some great DLC. But monsters weren't just cool and weird and creepy all at the same time. They were also a very early attempt to understand the world around us, because at the time, this was basically humans fumbling around with an early form of science. Unable to hop on a plane to figure out what's going on 1,000 miles away, people instead relied mostly on travelers returning from foreign lands who would tell scary stories about dragons lurking in the hillsides. And plenty of even skeptical budding philosophers would write these stories down, generally as pure fact, and attempt to make sense of these monstrous tales. This continued into ancient Rome, when Pliny the Elder's approach to writing the Western world's first known encyclopedia was, repeat anything anyone says word for word, especially if they're talking about dope monsters. To be fair, he did characterize more outrageous anecdotes with phrases like, some people say, or so the story goes. And his book was primarily about entertaining rather than educating. Kind of hilariously though, some of these tales would prove so salient that European travelers in the Middle Ages were alarmed not to find men with dog heads upon arriving in exotic lands. Now, it's easy to laugh at people from the past for believing in creatures like human man but give him dog head. And trust us, we laugh. Oh, how we laugh. But the thing is, when you think about just how gigantic the world seemed for people traveling on horseback, monster myths start to make a lot more sense. Most of the world was inaccessible to the average denizen of Greece or Rome, and as empires expanded, they started learning about some genuinely weird stuff, like this thing called the rhino, which I guess seems as plausible as three-horned zebras. It's also worth considering an argument from historian Adrienne Mayer. She thinks many monster myths, including the truly badass griffin, were actually based on fossils from extinct creatures unearthed by early archaeologists. Mayer argues that dinosaur skeletons, which in ancient Grecian times were quite literally visible to the naked eye on the Mediterranean seashore, helped perpetuate ancient beliefs about monsters. She even attributes the one-eyed Cyclops to a mistake in which early archaeological enthusiasts examined an elephant skull and decided its huge nasal cavity was just one big ol' eye socket. That's what my archaeologist pals like to call a whoopsie. Of course, fanciful ideas about real-life horned winged monsters remained mainstream long after ancient times, and we're not just talking about that Bigfoot truther group on social media. Even Thomas Jefferson believed that giant monsters existed on the American frontier and warned Lewis and Clark to keep an eye out for them as they explored the American continent. The point is that monster myths have long been a way to make sense of a world that is largely hostile to humans, to catalog potential predators, and to understand why nature gave some creature claws and me these ugly old feet. I really hate them. They look so bad. Now, this notion of monsters as marvels worthy of scientific study still permeates pop culture. It's also all over Monster Hunter Rise, a game that at its core is about the awe-inspiring, even if sometimes frightening world around us, and our attempts to try to understand it, control it, and most of all, survive it. I mean, you literally carry around a notebook to document and classify all the creatures you encounter on your adventures. And so rather than just being a game about scary monsters, Rise is about the reverence and fear inspired by the incredible world around us. Like adventurers of old, you have to leave your home to explore the unknown, except you might actually get to encounter a huge armored creature with a powerful sticky tongue, or a giant flying beast that could tear you apart with its fangs, except he'd rather enjoy a crunchy apple. And like a good scientist, you can figure out exactly what their glands are good for. But monsters weren't just of interest to scientists and scientist NPCs. They were also, and unlike this dream-haunting little guy, considered kind of good. As in, people literally thought they were a weird gift to humanity. See, for much of Christian history, monsters fascinated God-curious folks everywhere, sparking the question, how could a supreme creator make big ol' ugly monsters, and more importantly, why? Throughout the Middle Ages, religious leaders wrote tons of texts that proposed several different explanations. Early on, it was most common to see monsters as the divine creator's literal opponents, coming from Cain or the devil. But theologian Augustine helped reconsider that. He saw beasts like dragons or humans with dog heads as potent symbols of divine power, an indication that the laws of nature do not apply to the universe's head honcho. And by the late Middle Ages, monsters began to really be seen more as metaphors. People largely believe that monsters have been created to serve as examples for proper conduct and to reinforce the teachings of the Bible. For example, dragons were thought to reflect the dangers of Satan, while unicorns symbolized the death of Christ. This helps explain the popularity of the bestiaries, or books of beast. These glorious, often grotesque books cataloged common creatures like horses and dogs, exotic beasts like tigers and elephants, and best of all, imaginary monstrous beings like unicorns, griffins, and dragons with lavish illustrations. These weren't meant to be encyclopedias like Pliny the Elder made. Instead, the images were supposed to convey the animal's symbolism in order to propagate the predominant religious worldview. While initially intended for interchurch book clubs, they soon became popular luxury splurges for wealthy show-offs. Today, they're one of our best artistic catalogs of how medieval Europeans viewed the world and how they reconciled divine greatness with legends about monstrous creatures. And this weirdly positive spin on monsters was hardly exclusive to the Western world. In Japanese culture, legends about yokai, i.e., supernatural spirits and monsters, have long had metaphysical connotations. Some water-dwelling yokai, such as certain kinds of tatsu, i.e. dragons, were considered comparable to water gods, and praying or showing reverence to them was a way to prevent floods, drowning, or another lost round of chicken. Of course, some terrifying tatsu could not give two flying river stones about your prayers and might still drown your favorite horse. Still, here as with the bestiaries, we can see how monster myths can be a humbling force that makes human beings act a little more respectful towards the vast world around them. That's why oversimplifying monsters as just plain scary ruins a lot of what makes them so interesting. Which brings us back to our glorious sponsors. In Monster Hunter Rise, we meet lots of fanged, hoofed, or horned creatures who are a lot more complex and multifaceted than meets the eye. Far from just going stabby stab against monsters, the game mechanics require you to craft items, recipes, medicines, and even buildings by combining the resources you acquire as you hunt. And many of the monsters are directly inspired by yokai, our aforementioned group of monsters and spirits from Japanese folklore. The Tetranodon, for instance, is inspired by the Kappo, which, like the Tatsu, could really mess up your day by creating a flood, or refrain from doing so if they were in a good mood. The game itself takes some cues from the Japanese Hiyaki Yako, a recurring nightmarish motif in yokai folklore that basically functions as a monster parade. Some of its earliest iterations involve the spirits of discarded tools rising up against their former owners. They go on to attack a town, though unsuccessfully. In this version of the story, the spirits repent for their violence and convert to Buddhism, showing even mischievous tool spirits can find a better path in life. Heartwarming. In other versions, however, people simply have to hide from the monsters and wait out the attack. In Rise, these influences play out in the new Rampage quest type, in which you fight off hordes of monsters to prevent them from wreaking further havoc. While most of us no longer rely on bestiaries to get our monster kicks, monsters still remain important manifestations of social and cultural forces in any given society, representing our collective fears, desires, and preoccupations. This has been true for centuries and across cultures. See, ancient Japanese culture mostly identified yokai and creatures like foxes or serpents. But as man-made tools became more prominent, myths about yokai spirits dwelling in tools did as well, like in the Hiyaki Yako. It also presumably led to the inevitable question we've all asked ourselves: is your hammer trying to kill you? One particularly fascinating pre-modern Japanese yokai myth developed in farming villages as a response to a growing class of nouveau riche families who had gained power and become landlords. These families were said to possess tsukimono, or little animal spirits that brought good luck to them and lousy luck to their enemies. Families thought to be in possession of tsukimono were shunned for generations, which I mean, harsh, But ultimately, this mythos perfectly articulated existing social issues of the time, specifically class resentments. And in modern Japan, Gojira would do the same, as a giant sea monster brought back to life by nuclear radiation. The first film about him came out in 1954, when memories of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were fresh in the collective Japanese consciousness. At the time, America still occupied Japan and banned any talk of the bombings. The monster represented the fears, pain, and traumas that had gone unspoken in society. As Japanese culture evolved, Gojira would go on to articulate everything from fears about environmental degradation to concerns about modern technology. In a similar way, some of Western culture's most enduring monsters still hold power because of the way they commented on social changes. Take Frankenstein. Written by 19th century British author Mary Shelley, the monster articulated fears about the scientific revolution. Specifically, it seems to react to experiments like that of Italian scientist Luigi Galvani, who attempted to use electricity to reanimate the legs of dead frogs and sheep, and his creepazoid nephew who tried to do the same with human corpses. Frankenstein's monster, made from a mishmash of body parts, reanimated by the scientist in pursuit of greatness, thus represented the terrifying possibilities of scientific hubris gone unchecked. His enduring cultural status as an A-list monster makes sense. Society remains perpetually alarmed at the possibility that the latest science is going too far. Though until there's a microwave that can convincingly reheat a taco, I'm gonna say we still got a ways to go. Anyway, to this day, monsters remain apt metaphors in pop culture, and the Monster Hunter series has historically used monsters to represent social or cultural or even environmental phenomenon, like Nergigante in Monster Hunter World, who functions as a metaphor for ecological catastrophe. And with monsters like Magnamalo, a four-legged beast whose design is based on Japanese samurai ghost, right down to the balls of fire or Onibi. We can't wait to see what Rise has in store. Traditionally, these ghosts are portrayed as resentful, which makes us wonder if the game will continue the series' theme of humanity getting caught up in much larger natural forces, in this case, a rage-filled behemoth. There's also the Almudron, based on the Dorotabo. These guys are the spirits of dead farmers, who angrily watch as the farmers that come after mistreat their land. In line with Monster Hunter's ecological themes, they haunt away the poor stewards of the land in order to conserve their habitat. In Japan, where fertile land was hard to find, these myths expressed anxieties about good, fertile soil and the misuse of that rare and valuable resource. In short, we can't wait to see what Monster Hunter Rise has to offer. Whether they're inspiring scientists, confounding religious leaders, or expressing that thing we're all thinking but not saying, monsters matter, and not just because they make you cry out for your mommy. But what do you guys think? What purpose do monster stories serve in your life? Drop a comment and let us know. And thank you so much to Monster Hunter Rise and Capcom for making this deep dive into monsters possible. Monster Hunter Rise is now available on the Nintendo Switch. Be sure to check it out. The game's got an exciting new Rampage quest mode, brand new monsters, and a fun customizable hunting companion called a Palamute. We think you'll really enjoy it. And for me and my hammer, later.